metabolic problem. This is a statistic within the United States, but I'm going to show you the scope of the problem in just a moment, where it goes well beyond it. But this manuscript that was published a few years ago found that only 12% of US adults are considered metabolically healthy. Only 12%, isn't that remarkable? Now, throughout my talk, whenever I'm citing a scientific report, you'll notice in the bottom corner, there's going to be a PubMed identification number. That is the specific science article that I'm referring to, or that I'm referencing when I show this kind of information. And usually it will look something like this, with a filled box that has the title of the manuscript and then maybe a quote from it. But anyway, just so you know that I'm not making it up. I'm not that kind of scientist. I'm not I'm not an epidemiologist looking at disease trends. I'm an actual scientist. So 12% of US adults. Now, we may think, one of the things that's popular in the United States in particular is to think that the United States is the worst, which is something I don't have a lot of tolerance for, frankly. But even metabolically, these statistics in the United States are far from the worst. For example, the prevalence of metabolic problems is significantly higher in South Asia. It's also significantly higher in the Middle East, where once upon a time I did many talks with Joey Orton, who's here, and with his wife, because of the problem. The metabolic issue there is so substantial. In the Pacific Islands, it's significantly worse than it is within the United States. And remember, the problem here is bad, as you see in that box. In Southeast Asia, the problem is significantly worse. I'm going to come back to some of those parts of the world in a little bit when we talk about fat cells. We're going to talk a lot about fat cells. But years ago, I did a postdoctoral fellowship with Duke University in Singapore, of all places, because the metabolic problems there are so significant, and indeed significantly worse than we have. Even within our own backyard, within North America, the United States is not the worst. Metabolic problems within Mexico are significantly worse than they are within the United States. So I show you this to help you understand the prevalence of the problem. Insulin resistance is a global concern. It is indeed the most common health disorder in the world. Now, what is metabolic health? That's what I've been talking about, and I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself in my enthusiasm. But there are two ways to define metabolic health, two ways that I want to present to you. One is the metabolic syndrome, and the other idea is this concept referred to as metabolic flexibility. Now, here is the metabolic syndrome. It is this constellation of clinical concerns that tends to come together. They're clumped together very often. Now, the study that I mentioned to you earlier found that at least, it was 88% of US adults that had at least one of these. And you may say, well, that's a little too rigorous. And the metabolic syndrome technically is having the majority of them. But the metabolic syndrome wasn't always called the metabolic syndrome. Once upon a time, when it was first identified that these things tended to come together, it was referred to as the insulin resistance syndrome. Of course, I'm a scientist. I like precision in all things, even my haircut. But in this case, the insulin resistance syndrome is a better term because it is more precise in identifying what is the actual root problem. If you were a clinician and you said to someone, you have metabolic syndrome, they won't know what you're talking about. Even if you showed them the constellation of specific problems, they would wonder what they all have in common. If you call it the insulin resistance syndrome, you know what the problem is, even if it doesn't sound quite as sexy, because metabolic has such a nice ring to it. Now, let's go on to the other definition of metabolic health, namely metabolic flexibility. I bet this is a concept some of you have heard before, even within unicity perhaps. I'd like to think that if you have heard of it within unicity, I had some small part in contributing to that. But nevertheless, the human body... I think I did that, sorry. Now it's just blinking red and green.
It might have died.
Oh, here we go. Not with my voice. I used to be in a barbershop quartet. when I lived in North Carolina. And the name of our barbershop quartet was Three Nice Guys. Yeah, oh no. But then I was in another one later called The Ketones. So the human body is a metabolic hybrid, where at any moment we are primarily relying on one of two fuel sources. We're either burning glucose, or what I like to say sugar, blood sugar, or we're burning fat. And what dictates that process is the hormone insulin. If insulin is elevated, the body is sugar burning. If insulin is low at a fasted level, the body is fat burning. Now, neither of those is inherently better than the other. I don't want you to think that, gosh, we always need to be in fat burning. No, if you're only ever fat burning and never burning blood sugar, well, that's going to be something like diabetes, where your blood sugar levels get too high. We want to be able to burn both. You're right, Joe. Okay. So we want to be able to burn both. We want to have that kind of flexibility. So if we eat a meal that has a bunch of stuff in it, we want to be able to burn the sugar from that stuff. Because if blood sugar levels get too high and stay too high for too long, it can kill us. It's acutely lethal. We have to have a way of burning it off. And the body has a very finite storage for glucose, or blood sugar, and I'll come back to that later. And then when we start to fast, then we can shift over a few hours after eating, and I'll show you a different image of this later. We want to be able to shift over to fat burning. So the ability to flux between the two fuel sources is the essence of metabolic flexibility. Now, however, what predominates these days is metabolic inflexibility. That's what it was referred to when it was first defined by scientists in Pittsburgh. This idea that even when a person is in what should be considered a fasted state, their insulin levels are so chronically elevated that they're stuck in sugar burning mode. They can't get out of it. Of course, you can see the consequence of this. If you are primarily sugar burning and your fat burning has been essentially turned off, good luck losing fat. And specifically shrinking your fat cells, which is something I'll get to more in a moment. So these are the two problems, or the two definitions, two ways of defining metabolic health. And remember, it's the absence of metabolic health that is so predominant around the world. Now, what these two things have in common is a condition called insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance is more relevant than just the metabolic syndrome or just metabolic flexibility. Insulin resistance directly contributes to the leading causes of death. If you look at the top killers, the top chronic diseases, what I refer to as the plagues of prosperity, insulin resistance is the root that is connecting them all. Whether it's the leading cause of death, heart disease, or one of the other top 10s in diabetes and cancer, or whether it's the most common liver disorder worldwide in fatty liver disease, or of course, simply having too much fat, these, you look at them and think they have nothing in common. They do. Insulin resistance is the common core. But beyond this, beyond the lethal problems, are the more heartbreaking or tragic or frustrating issues of infertility. I won't get into this in the time that we have today, but it is essentially, it's almost impossible to have polycystic ovary syndrome, the most common form of infertility in females, without her body having some degree of insulin resistance as a cause. Much more accurate than calling it PCOS, we should be calling it metabolic infertility. To a degree, we could say the same thing about the most common form of infertility in men, erectile dysfunction. The statistics on erectile dysfunction are mind-blowing. It is remarkable how much more common and how young these men are nowadays that have erectile dysfunction. Once again, that is a reflection of insulin resistance in how insulin resistance affects his blood vessels, compromising blood flow. Once again, not something I'll get into, but happy to answer any questions. And then finally, just to wrap up this demonic wheel of misfortune, and I'm your demented game show host, we have things like dementia. and migraine headaches as well. These have been known for decades. In the case of migraines, we've known for about 100 years that there's a metabolic component to many of them. All right, so in other words, to put a fine point on it, understanding insulin resistance gives us an insight into what is killing us, the chronic diseases that we're all very mindful of. Now, what is insulin? I've been talking about insulin so much, and while I'm speaking about it as a bit of a villain, I don't mean to. It is absolutely an essential hormone. We must have it. We just want it to behave. But I want to define it for you. So insulin is a little hormone, and it is indeed little. If you measured it in a laboratory setting, it's remarkable how low, how small a molecule is. It has a very, very low, what's called molecular weight, but boy, it packs a hell of a punch. Because even though it's small, its levels in the bloodstream are remarkably low. It is so powerful. And literally, every cell of the body responds to it. I'll get to that more in a moment. But insulin is released from the beta cells of the pancreas, and it is stimulated. Its primary stimulus is when glucose levels go up. So when glucose starts to climb, or blood sugar starts to go up, insulin will be released in response to that. Because one of insulin's actions is to reduce blood glucose. Now, I emphasize that, and I want to make sure you do too whenever you talk about it. One of insulin's actions is to reduce blood glucose. Not its only action, and I would say not even its most important action. One of insulin's actions is to reduce blood glucose. And that's simply reflective of the fact that when it comes to nutrients in the body, insulin is the key. Insulin's kind of thematic effect throughout the body is to control energy use. Part of that is lowering blood glucose, but it also is involved in fat synthesis and in protein synthesis and the growth of cells and the death of cells in certain instances, as well as handling electrolytes in and out of the cells of the body, and much, much more. Now, let's just kind of pause for a moment, and I'm going to do a pop quiz. Nothing thrills a professor more than a pop quiz. So here we go. Do you have insulin resistance? Think through these questions. Do you have high blood pressure? Do you have a family history of some diabetic complications, type 2 or gestational? Type 1 doesn't count here. That's not a metabolic problem. Do you have PCOS or erectile dysfunction, fatty liver disease? And you might, an indicator of fatty liver disease would be getting a blood test where they measure your ALT and AST levels. That'll be familiar to some of you. Or sometimes you need not look any further than the skin. The skin can be the window to the metabolic soul. And if a person has skin tags, or this kind of dark, rough little patch of skin, commonly around the neck, also the armpits, sometimes wherever the skin can fold over onto each other, you can have these problems. It is almost proof positive that if you see these on someone, they have insulin resistance. The nice thing is, because they are such a result of insulin resistance, as frustrating as they may be, if the insulin resistance gets better, and you will be very armed with the knowledge of how to do that by the end of this, those go away. All of it. So if you answered yes to even one of these questions, I have bad news. But you might not know it. That's why I do this little quiz, because it's helpful for people to understand just the scope of this problem. And most people, again, don't know that they have the problem. Now, up until this point, I have been talking a lot about what insulin resistance, its problem. But I appreciate the fact that we haven't really defined it yet. And let's do that now. If I'm describing insulin resistance as the villain, then we gotta know what it is, who it is. So here is a cell. Insulin resistance is best, at least initially understood, at the level of a cell. And it could be any cell of the body. The animations, the story I'm about to tell you, we could be talking about any cell, because literally every cell of the body has insulin receptors. And I'm around 20-year-olds because I'm a professor, and I appreciate how people use the word literally nowadays. I don't use the word literally too liberally. I mean literally, every cell of the body has an insulin receptor, from brain cells to bone cells, lung cells to liver cells, and all of them in between. It doesn't matter. They all have this little doorway that is specifically designed for the hormone insulin, as it's flowing through the blood, to come and knock on the door of that cell. And because it can be any cell of the body, we'll just say that when insulin comes and knocks, there is an action. No surprise, right? What insulin does at a neuron is going to be different from what it does at the skin. So we'll just say that it's an action. Now, its most famous action is to take the glucose from the blood and push it, if you will, or open the doors, to be a little more accurate. Open the doors to allow the glucose to come rushing from the blood, thereby lowering blood glucose, into the cell, to be stored for energy for later, if it's, say, the liver, or to be burned for energy, if it's the muscle, or the neuron, or whatever else it may be. Again, that's just its most famous action, not its only action. Now, sometimes, for reasons that we'll talk about more in a moment, the action gets diminished. Where insulin is politely knocking on the door of the cell isn't listening anymore. It's not responding as well as it used to. A consequence of this, of course, the consequences would be myriad, including all of the problems around that wheel of misfortune that I highlighted a moment ago. But one obvious consequence would be that blood glucose levels start to climb. That's no surprise, right? If insulin is necessary to open the doors for the glucose, if insulin can't open the doors, the glucose can't come in as well, and now blood glucose levels start to climb, or blood sugar. At the same time, if that amount of insulin that we had in the body earlier was no longer enough, then the body will have more insulin. Now that's a little complicated, and I'm going to talk about that more here, but I'm presenting to you the paradigm in which insulin resistance is contributing to elevated insulin. And that's not wrong, it's just not the whole story. But this is part of a compensatory mechanism. Because if one little molecule of insulin politely knocking on the door wasn't enough to get the cell to do something, well then we need a big mob. And so now we have a group of insulin, and insulin is inundating the cell, all in an effort to just try to restore the action, to get the cellular response to insulin back to where it was. But there are consequences to having a body with lots of insulin, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, there are two things. In my very thorough university-level description, because this is literally how I teach it in my class. In fact, I use these exact slides when I'm teaching my students. There are two things in this definition that I want you to take away. First, of the definition of insulin resistance. Firstly, some cells, not all cells, some cells aren't responding as well to insulin as they used to. And that's very important. It's not a global phenomenon. In fact, it's part of what's so insidious about insulin resistance. Because, for example, the theca cells of the ovary in a woman are still responsive to insulin. And that's relevant in the next problem, the second definition here. So again, the ovaries are totally sensitive to insulin all the time. Unlike her male counterpart's blood vessels, his blood vessels become insulin resistant. And now the insulin can't dilate them as well, and he has erectile dysfunction. This matters when we appreciate that only some cells are insulin resistant, when I bring in the second part of this definition, the other side of the coin that we call insulin resistance, and that is that insulin levels in the entire body are higher and higher and higher than they used to be. This is a condition called hyperinsulinemia, and it is inseparably connected to insulin resistance. There is no such thing as insulin resistance without elevated insulin levels. It is impossible in every single iteration of insulin resistance, and there are many, pathological and physiological. But let's go back to the example of the infertility for just a moment. Remember, now to the man's blood vessels that are insulin resistant with erectile dysfunction, the elevated insulin isn't hurting the blood vessels. It's just trying to restore some of the function. But what about the ovaries? Remember, the ovaries were still exquisitely sensitive to insulin, but now insulin is telling them to do too much, and it ends up disrupting the ovaries' abilities to produce estrogens, and the ovaries end up producing too many androgens, or too much testosterone. It is totally a result of the elevated insulin and how that insulin is affecting the ovaries. Again, not the scope of the lecture today, maybe a topic for another time. All right, now, We have explained insulin resistance and identified what it is, but it is so popular nowadays to not only have a story about a villain, but also give the backstory. So let's do that now. Let's talk about where insulin resistance comes from. There are 3 primary causes of insulin resistance: stress, inflammation, and hyperinsulinemia, or elevated insulin levels. When I say primary, I'm being very, very precise. Remember, I love precision. By primary, I mean that every one of these 3 causes are not only independent of each other, each is capable independently of causing insulin resistance, but they also are able to do so in every available biomedical model. Now, I'm speaking very kind of granular now, but as a scientist, we will commonly do experiments, as a biomedical scientist, in 3 types of experimental models. We will use isolated cells growing in a little petri dish. We will use animals, and at the pinnacle of all creation, we will use humans. These, in every case, are capable of causing insulin resistance on their own in all 3 of those models, which is why I consider them to be primary. There are secondary causes too, but we don't have time for that. All right, these are the 3. Now let's define them a little bit and identify how they relate to insulin resistance. But hyperinsulinemia is the big one. It is the elephant in the room that after I get done describing to you the role of stress and inflammation, because they matter, they do, but you can control, you can do everything you can to improve stress, do everything you can to improve inflammation, and it may have a modest benefit. It's just difficult to control those. It is not difficult to control insulin through mechanisms I'll show you later. All right, now let's talk about stress. I teach, so Sam had mentioned his cousin. Is that who it was, Sam? I think it was his cousin who took my class at BYU. I teach that undergraduate class, pathophysiology, but I also teach a graduate class in endocrinology. Those are my 2 teaching assignments. So I have a particular affection and even fascination for hormones. This is how we define stress, by the hormones, by the prototypical stress hormones, specifically cortisol and epinephrine. Now, cortisol and epinephrine are both considered stress hormones, but they actually have almost nothing in common. They come from totally different cell types. They're produced totally differently. They move through the blood in different ways. They act or signal on cells in totally different ways. The one thing they have in common is that they want to increase blood sugar. And they do so very, very well. And very, very quickly. But if these stress hormones are elevated, they're going to constantly be trying to push the glucose levels up. Of course, that puts them at odds with a particular other hormone. Can you think of one? Who wants to push glucose down? Insulin. Yeah, of course, insulin. But the more the stress hormones are present, pushing the glucose up, the harder and harder insulin has to work. It's almost as if the body's becoming resistant to it. And indeed it is. So these 2 stress hormones are capable of causing insulin resistance on their own in all of the biomedical models. Now let me talk about stress in a little more detail. And this one hits a little close to home, because I am just a terrible sleeper. I have been ever since our first little adorable baby was born. Sam, good luck with yours. My philosophy as a young dad was, that was during my PhD, that anytime our little beautiful Samara needed to wake up at night, or just decided to wake up, I should say, she never needed to wake up. But if Cheryl didn't need to breastfeed her, then I said, you wait, you let me take it. And so, unfortunately, if Cheryl needed to go to little Samara, she could just lay there and breastfeed and kind of doze off. I had to be walking around and, bouncing her around. Now, I don't regret it, but ever since then, boy, I am a sleep-deprived dad. Now, other than my own personal grief here, what does that have to do with this? Sleep deprivation increases cortisol. And you already know, you remember now, cortisol is a primary stress hormone. And so, cortisol starts to climb after poor sleep. That, of course, will increase blood glucose, and it will. Do any of you ever wear continuous glucose monitors? Yeah. So if you have a sleep deprivation one night, you get a really rough night, you will absolutely see the next morning your blood glucose levels. You're going to struggle much harder to control your blood glucose. And the more cortisol from your sleep deprivation is trying to push your glucose up, the harder insulin has to work, and we have insulin resistance. In fact, this study was published a number of years ago. They took young, perfectly healthy men, and they sleep deprived them of a few hours just one night. And they found that the next day they were 25% more insulin resistant than they were the day before. That's not insignificant. Just one night. Now, thankfully, one good night can undo it. It just can be hard to get that one good night. Now, this even is relevant for kids. This was a paper just published a few months ago. That's how kind of cutting edge the science is here. They looked at kids in 2 age groups, and they noted that children that are between the ages of 6 to 12 should be getting a minimum of 9 hours, 9 to 12 hours a night. I would say absolutely closer to the 12 side there. And even teenagers, they need about at least 8 to 10 hours a night. And they found over years that if a child was consistently just deprived of only 1 hour a night, consistently, outside this window, so cutting into that narrowest time, that over the next few years, they were almost 3 times more likely to have clinically identified insulin resistance. Isn't that sobering? It's crazy. So parents or grandparents, this is a fight worth having with these darling little cherubs. It is that bedtime is set, and you're not doing them any favors by letting it cut into that. All right, now let's move on to inflammation. One way to define inflammation are by these little molecules called cytokines. Have you guys ever heard that word before? So cytokines are pro and anti-inflammatory molecules. They're basically molecules of the immune system. That when the immune cells get activated, they will start to dump these cytokines into the body. Cytokines, then, it's no surprise, commonly are molecules that will increase inflammation. So more cytokines means more inflammation. But the more inflammation there is in the body, the more that the majority of the body's cells are becoming insulin resistant. Now, you may think, okay, well, this is obviously a problem with an infection or illness or something. Like I have allergies right now in the spring. I've been wearing my CGM. Oh my gosh, my glucose levels are crazy because allergies are a bit of an immune response. My body thinks that these pollens coming in are kind of harmful, so it's trying to defend my body from it. So I'm seeing it in real time, but you would too. If you were monitoring your glucose levels, or if you had a way of monitoring your insulin resistance, but you don't, unfortunately, you would see that when the body is sick, it's very insulin resistant. This also is relevant with autoimmune diseases. One of the studies that I'm citing here is a study done in women with rheumatoid arthritis. Women naturally suffer from autoimmune disorders more frequently than men do, and it's an estrogen-related phenomenon. As much as estrogen is a kind of metabolic powerhouse molecule, and it is, there are consequences as well. But this particular study tracked the rheumatoid arthritis, how it would wax and wane, ebb and flow, and they found that as the rheumatoid arthritis was active or quiet, so too was the insulin resistance, that it went lockstep with the autoimmune problem. Also, air pollution, or inhaled particles from cigarette smoke, or burning certain things, the diesel exhaust. Some of the citations there are from my own lab. We've contributed to that information. And then lastly, enlarged fat cells. That seems strange, it won't soon enough. All right, now let's go on to the elephant in the room. Of these 3 problems, I told you that hyperinsulinemia is the most relevant. It's the most relevant because it is the greatest contributor, and it's also, thankfully, the one that we can do the most about. Because if you were sitting across from someone and you knew that their stress hormones were elevated, and you said this is contributing to your insulin resistance, then they would say, well, how can I lower my stress? And you'd say, I don't really know. Try to sleep a little better, easier said than done, right? The more you worry about sleeping better, the less you're going to get. Or you say, hey, your cytokines are a little high. You have a little high inflammation. And they'd say, well, gosh, how do I lower my inflammation? I don't really know. I don't really know what's contributing to it. But if you measure the insulin, find it's high, and they say, well, what can I do about it? Then you say, have I got a solution for you? Which we'll get to. I'm getting ahead of myself. But when insulin is chronically elevated, the body becomes increasingly less sensitive to that insulin. It fails to respond as well as it used to. This is actually a deep principle. Indeed, even I would submit, I'm a very religious person, I believe that there's a principle here that goes well beyond just the body, which is to say that a constant stimulus will result in a resistance to that stimulus. The system, whatever it would be, will start to say, I can't handle this much of whatever you're trying to give me. So any constant stimulus will eventually lead to a resistance to that stimulus. Insulin is no exception. Other hormones aren't either. Other hormones like leptin. I'm sure you've heard of leptin before. The body can become leptin resistant as well. And many, many other hormones play into this. Now, let me just use a funny little analogy. I've already mentioned my darling wife, and we have children and we love them. They are insane and frustrating, but we love them. Now, Cheryl is with the kids a lot. And my kids are very, very loud, remarkably loud. I'm sure they're louder than your kids, I just know it. So Cheryl, it's interesting for me to notice when I'm home, where the kids, in all of their volume coming from them, they will be in a part of the house and they will be shouting for mom or shouting for something. They need something, they need something, they always need something. Right? And I'm amazed that I will be noticing the whole dynamic, and my wife doesn't hear it at all. She doesn't hear it. The signal just isn't getting received. Or, to go back to my earlier paradigm, there's no action in response to the signal. She hears the signal all the time. She's so used to it as a full-time homemaker, she hears that noise all the time, and she's just downgraded her sensitivity in order to survive. She, I think, knows when it is like life or death. I am not around the kids as much. And so when I hear that outburst, I hear it very, very well. Because I don't hear it very often. I'm at work. I'm with students who are listening rapidly. Actually, the challenge nowadays is to get them to look at me and not Instagram or something else. That's why I kind of have my particular lecture style. My philosophy on teaching is I have to compete with social media. Because nowadays you do. But back to this, I hear it all. And I react. Boy, do I ever react. No, not too much. But there's an action. I hear the signal very clearly because I don't get it as often as my darling wife does. That's kind of the metaphor. Now, let's bring it back to the body and help us understand why this is such a problem. Here is, actually I was going to say an average person, but it's not an average person. This is the less common individual, and this is what happens to their insulin levels throughout the day. I say less common because this is the person who's remarkably only eating 3 times a day. But this is what the insulin levels would look like in an insulin-sensitive person, which I'll mention more in a moment. But the average individual is not only eating these big meals, but also snacking in all of the little gaps. You think about it, this is the person, they wake up and they eat their typical breakfast. Then a few hours later, they have a snack. Then a couple hours later, they have lunch. Then a couple hours later, they have a mid-afternoon snack, and they keep doing it again. Every potential low moment gets filled in. So this is the average person, who, in fact, not even average. This is an insulin-sensitive person. If I were to do this kind of study, or this response to insulin, which I do, in my lab, with, say, a young, healthy 21-year-old undergraduate student, that's what it would look like. But if I went to a middle-aged person who's a little overweight, their response to these same stimuli, they could eat the exact same thing that this young kid did, and their insulin levels are going to look a little like that. Where every waking moment is spent in a state of elevated insulin. You can see that this is a common way of living, and it helps put a fine point on the effect or the relevance of chronically elevated insulin. Again, the technical term for that is hyperinsulinemia. Most people are living a life, again, where every waking moment is spent with elevated insulin. Well, good luck trying to be metabolically flexible. Good luck activating things like autophagy, which I'm not talking about in this lecture. You can't do that if insulin's elevated. Now, another thing that happens, I told you we were going to get to the fat cells, is the effect of insulin on the fat cells. Indeed, there is no signal, none, zero. There is no signal that is stronger than insulin when it comes to controlling fat cell growing and shrinking. Now, when I say fat tissue, I mean the entire sort of pinchable, chuggable fat, not specifically the cells of the fat. But fat tissue must grow if insulin is elevated. There can be no other response other than death. If insulin goes up, fat tissue is growing. It is an absolute certainty. Now there's a little nuance there when it comes to calories and energy and stuff, but I want you to know you cannot make fat tissue grow without elevated insulin. Do any of you have any kids, grandkids who were type 1 diabetic? But I bet you know some people who did. Think about in your mind, how does the little type 1, or not little, but the kid, or even adult in some instances, who becomes type 1 diabetic, how do they look? They look scrawnier and scrawnier and scrawnier. Ironically, they may be eating thousands of calories a day in excess. You can have a little 12-year-old who has lost all their body fat and looks like they're a prisoner of war while eating 6,000 calories a day. You'd say that's thermodynamically, if the laws of thermodynamics perfectly hold within the body, that should be impossible. It's silly, though, to invoke calories in, calories out when it comes to body fat. But I didn't intend to go off on this tangent, but I'll finish it. You look at that little kid, in the absence of insulin, that body cannot keep fat on itself. And then the moment you start giving the diabetic, a type 1 diabetic, which is a disease of no insulin, the moment you start giving them insulin, two things happen. They start eating a little less, their appetite suddenly becomes better, and they go from 5,000 calories to maybe 2,000 or 1,500 as a little kid. Adults should not be 1,500. And then at the same time, they start getting fat, or just gaining fat. I don't mean that they're getting overweight, but now suddenly they have a little meat on their bones, but they're eating less. It's because insulin takes that energy that's coming in and says, I know just what to do with you. Go to the fat cells, and other tissue too, but fat cells especially. Fat cells are unique. All right, now, when fat tissue, what we can pinch and jiggle, is being told to grow, it can technically grow through two different ways. It can grow through a process called hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Hypertrophy, which is by far the most common form of fat growth in adults, less so in kids. Hypertrophy is a result of when the number of fat cells is staying the same. This is important, and I very much hope this is part of what can become part of your story too, when you're talking to people. Hypertrophy happens when the number of fat cells is set, but each individual cell is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That stands in contrast to hyperplastic fat growth. When fat cells are undergoing hyperplasia, the size of the fat cell stays quite modest, because when the fat cells are being pressured to grow, and who pressures them to grow? Insulin does. Some fat cells in some people have, especially at certain times of life, or in certain parts of the body when it comes to bodies with a lot of estrogen, like the butt and hips, there can be a degree of new fat cell growth. And so the fat cells individually don't get too big. Rather than getting too big, the moment there's a little pressure to start growing, they'll grow a little, and then they'll simply pull in a new fat cell. The fat cell wants their friends to carry some of the metabolic burden. That's exactly what happens. So that's the difference between them. Now, I actually just inserted this about 30 minutes before I met Amanda in the parking in the hotel and came over. Have you heard of Wegovy and Ozempic? Yeah, I bet there's some other trade names outside the U.S., but I've never seen anything like this before. Really, and I've been in this biomedical field for 25 years almost. It's insane. I've never seen a class of drug go from nothing to not only very big business, but bragged about. People brag about taking it.
They have shirts.
Yeah. They brag on the Met Gala was called the Ozempic Gala, I think. I hope none of you watched that drivel. But nevertheless, these are drugs. This would be a whole topic for another time, and it is in my endocrinology class. And I won't get into it, but this is part of the mechanism whereby these drugs improve metabolic problems, and they do because they stimulate the fat cells to reproduce, which allows the fat cells to get smaller. Now, you're thinking, but wait, Bikman, how then are these people losing weight? It's because the drug also is stimulating fat burning. And so while you're making more fat cells, you're also shrinking the biggest ones. And so the actual mass of fat on the body, the net effect is a reduction. But the main mechanism of action, in addition to those where the person's losing so much weight, is the nausea. These drugs make people just feel a little sick to their stomachs, and they don't want to eat anything. But about 2 years in, 24 months after initiation of the drug, the cravings start to come back. And so the artificial drug-induced discipline, if you will, or cravings avoidance starts to go away. Or they decide they can't pay for the drug anymore, and then you stop taking the drug, the cravings come back, and guess what you're left with? Remember, you have more fat cells than you did before you ever started those injections. So if some of you are already on these drugs, just be careful with them. I would say use them at the lowest possible dose. Not that I'm giving any medical advice, and I'm not, but be very careful with them. No drug is ever all good, ever. All right, now let's get back to the topic at hand. And me convincing you of the relevance of insulin in stimulating fat tissue growth. Here's a paper, that's the title of the manuscript. And this manuscript was fascinating. I really appreciate it as a scientist because they took fat biopsies, which is something we do in my lab. So they took fat biopsies from the subcutaneous abdominal fat. They took a fat biopsy. I actually have it. So they took fat biopsies from the people from 2 different spots, but it was the same part of the body. So they took fat biopsies from one area of the body in these diabetic patients that were on insulin therapy. They took a biopsy from the area that was always getting the insulin injection, because you know a common site of insulin injection will be the belly. They'll pinch their fat and then do the insulin injection. And they're told, diabetics are told to rotate their injection sites in any of the fat tissue they can get it into, just because fat sort of slowly disperses it through the body, the insulin, rather than muscle. If it goes in the muscle, it's too fast, the muscle takes it all. So they will do a fat biopsy, so make a little cut, again, we do this in my lab, pull out a little piece of fat and then go study it. But then they went a few inches over, still from the abdominal subcutaneous fat, and took another biopsy, but of the area that doesn't see a lot of insulin. And this is what the fat cells look like. The fat cells that were biopsied at the area of the insulin injections were by volume, not the diameter you see in this 2-dimensional image, but the volume of these spheroid fat cells were about 10 times bigger than the fat cells that were just right next door, but not getting all the insulin injections. Now remember, we just got done talking about these processes. So in other words, what is the insulin doing? Is it activating hypertrophy or hyperplasia? Hypertrophy. Those fat cells are now 10 times bigger than the other ones that aren't getting the full injection of insulin. This is what it looks like at a microscopic level, but this is what it looks like from a macroscopic level. These are actual images from the manuscript. And you can see on these people this aberrant, strange accumulation of fat. It's because insulin is stimulating those fat cells to grow 10 times bigger than they were before. And this is what it looks like at the macro level. Those are not tumors. They're just big pockets of fat. All right, now, you know thoroughly what is the difference between hypertrophic fat growth and hyperplastic fat growth. Let's get a little deeper into them. Hypertrophic fat growth is pathogenic. It is harmful to the body. When those fat cells get too big, there are problems, and we'll talk about the problems in just a moment. In contrast, if fat tissue is growing, but it's growing through a process called hyperplasia, it's perfectly benign. This is why women will have more fat than men, they should, and be healthier with it. Because women, because of estrogen, will typically store more fat through hyperplasia. Whereas men, no, we're done. Whatever number of fat cells we have when we go through puberty, we will not get more in all but a very, very, very small subset of men. This is why when the man is getting fatter and fatter on his belly, it feels firm. Not necessarily because of the visceral fat, which is something I'm not talking about, but it's because as the fat cells get bigger and bigger, they get harder and more rigid. If the fat cells are small, there's a lot of them, then it's very jiggly. Much more pinchable and jiggable and huggable. Okay, now there are two reasons why hypertrophic fat cells are more pathogenic or harmful, specifically metabolically, or you could say cardio-metabolically. The first one is that as the cells continue to grow, remember, insulin can promote their growth to up to 10 times volumetrically than normal. They start to reach a point of maximum dimension. There's no cell type in the body that is capable of growing as much as insulin can make the fat cell grow. So in this case, the fat cell's essentially gotten to a point where it can't store anymore. And if it continues to grow, it will literally burst. It's like a bubble. When you're blowing a bubble, there's a finite surface area capable of handling the increased volume. And the moment the bubble gets too big, the membrane can no longer hold it and the bubble pops. That is exactly what can happen if a fat cell gets too big. The fat cell doesn't want that. That is a very messy death, very harmful to the body. And so it becomes insulin resistant in order to prevent further growth. Because insulin's trying to tell it to grow. The fat cell's saying, I can't listen to you anymore. Because if I keep listening to you, bad things are going to happen. You've become a bad friend. All right, so this, an analogy here, where I'm a professor and I got to keep 22-year-olds engaged or 20-year-olds, even worse. So it's like a train here. And we've spent, my family and I, a wonderful amount of time in Asia. And boy, those subway trains in Singapore or Hong Kong, oof, they can become chaotic. Now, let's imagine that in one version of this, we have passengers that are boarding the train car. And when the train car gets full, rather than forcing more passengers into the train car, we simply hook up another train car to the train. And when that one gets moderately full, we never let it get too full, we just keep hooking up train cars. And so every passenger is comfortable in the train, none of the train cars are too packed, and everyone's happy and healthy, I would say. However, in another version of this story, we have a train that has a finite number of train cars. It cannot add train cars. And so if insulin, as kind of an usher here, as insulin is trying to force the passengers in the train car gets full, and full, and full. And no more passengers can be put in there, but insulin doesn't stop. Insulin keeps forcing the passengers in the train car. And the passengers aren't happy, and they start sneaking out the window. Even though the insulin, the usher, doesn't want that to happen, but the people in the train car know, we just can't tolerate this, we have to get out. This is analogous to the fat cell, which has undergone such dramatic hypertrophy that even though insulin is trying to tell it to continue to grow, the fat cell stops listening. And one of the consequences of this is that it starts leaking fats into the blood in the form of free fatty acids. If you are ever able to measure your free fatty acids, I would strongly encourage you to do it. There's a little nuance here in a brief tangent. How am I doing time? A brief tangent is that you can measure your free fatty acids and your insulin. And if your insulin is low, then you are in fat burning mode. So if insulin is low, what do you think would normally happen to free fatty acids? It should be high, because you're fat burning. You're moving the fat out of your fat cells. If insulin is elevated because you just ate a bagel or something, insulin wants to inhibit fat burning, so what should happen to free fatty acids? It should go down. These two should never be in the same direction at the same time. If they are in the same direction at the same time, you know your fat cells aren't listening anymore. They're hypertrophic, they're insulin resistant. That test, which is called the adipose IR test or score, it's just by taking free fatty acids, timesing it, multiplying it by insulin, There's different levels in men and women. But by US units, it should be about 6 in men, about 8 in women. Women actually have higher free fatty acids. Women, you're actually burning fat faster than your male counterparts are at any moment. You're just putting more in at the same time, but you're burning it. Anyway, they shouldn't be high at the same time. All right, but I'm having too many tangents. I gotta stick to the topic. Quit distracting me. All right, the other problem is that the hypertrophic fat cells start to suffocate. Now that's a silly way of describing what is technically called hypoxia. Hypoxia, and remember, you choose what of what I'm saying, you choose what is the best kind of words, what's the vernacular you want to use when you're describing this to friends and family. So the cells become hypoxic, or they're suffocating, they can't get enough oxygen. Like every cell of the body, fat cells have a metabolic rate, that means they need oxygen and they need nutrients. But when the fat cells get too big, there's a problem. So here is a blood vessel, a little red circle at the bottom. And those are 2 little fat cells, and roughly in proportion size, from a blood vessel to a fat cell. A cell needs to be about 50 micrometers away from a capillary, the smallest blood vessel where everything's going in and out of the blood, in order for it to survive and be healthy. The problem comes when a fat cell gets so big, it can get to a diameter of 300 micrometers. Now, that fat cell is close enough to the capillary itself. It is able to get oxygen, it can breathe, and it can get nutrients. But what about the fat cell right next to it? It's now multiples too far away from the capillary. It just can't get it. Whatever's coming from the blood or whatever it wants to give back in the form of, say, carbon dioxide and other metabolites, it can't do so. It's simply too far. Well, this is what's happening within the enlarged fat cells. These enlarged fat cells are just suffocating. They're pushing each other too far away from the blood flow, and they become hypoxic. Well, one way the fat has to correct it is by producing cytokines. Do you remember when I talked about cytokines before? Cytokines, some cytokines have an effect to increase the growth of new blood vessels, a process called angiogenesis. So some cytokines can activate angiogenesis. But at the same time, there are a bunch of other cytokines coming from these fat cells that are just ramping up inflammation. So enlarged fat cells become pro-inflammatory. So these are the 2 problems. If we review them very briefly, hypertrophic fat cells run out of room, and in order to prevent potentially lethal growth, they become insulin resistant, leaking fats, even though insulin's telling you not to. At the same time, the hypertrophic fat cells become hypoxic. They are not getting enough blood, enough oxygen. They try to correct that by stimulating the growth of new blood vessels, but at the same time, they begin promoting inflammation. It almost makes you feel bad for the fat cells, don't you? Because the 2 things they're doing to try to ensure their own survival happen to be 2 things that make the rest of the body hate them. It's like the friend no one wants around. All right, now this concept introduces us to this concept, a further concept called the personal fat threshold, where a body has a finite, every individual, their genetics and their sex, and of course sex is genetic, but that plays into it very much. Even within sex, you can have different genetic sort of varieties here. But each individual person has a different amount of fat that their fat cells are going to say that they want to hold. A personal fat threshold. And for this guy, we're just saying, there it is. You know, of course, please do not misunderstand my pictures here. I don't mean to say that this guy can only store fat up into his sternum, and then anything above that is making him sick. That's not what I mean to say. I mean, if you look at his entire body as a certain amount of fat, his body is capable of storing. And if he's below that threshold, so if that's his threshold and he has this much fat on his body, his fat cells are happy. They're not too full, and he's insulin sensitive. If, however, his fat mass goes beyond the ideal level or the ceiling for his fat storage in a healthy way, now he has become insulin resistant. It is the personal fat threshold is just a kind of compelling way of asking the same question: are your fat cells hypertrophic, or are your fat cells hyperplastic? That's the difference. That's kind of what we're asking. Now, let's imagine if a person were able to stimulate the growth of new fat cells, like through a drug intervention, perhaps. Well, what happens to that fat threshold? If you can store more fat on your body all of a sudden because you've turned your hypertrophic fat cells into hyperplastic fat cells, what do you think happens to the threshold? The amount of fat you can store before it becomes harmful.
It goes up.
It goes up. And so let's say in this guy, even though his actual amount of fat didn't change on his body, by stimulating the growth of new fat cells, he was able to push his threshold up, and he's insulin sensitive as a result. Now, there's a consequence, right? Where there are other classes of drug medication, of drugs for diabetes called TZDs, thiazolidinediones. These are drugs like rosiglitazone. Some of you in the medical field will have heard of these before. But they are drugs that will, on one hand, improve their type 2 diabetes by improving insulin sensitivity, but because they act by stimulating new fat cells, a little bit like Wegovy and Ozempic, they make them fatter. It doesn't have the fat burning effect of Wegovy and Ozempic, though. So paradoxically, they're getting fatter while they're getting more insulin sensitive. It's because they're pushing their fat threshold higher and higher. Now, one of the reasons I did my fellowship in Singapore, of all places, is because that part of the world is very interested in the fact that you can have a Chinese, or in this case, a South Asian ethnicity, and this person can be significantly leaner than his overweight Caucasian counterpart, and yet he will have the diabetes before the Caucasian will. Or, to make it a little more direct, if you had two guys and they were both gaining fat at the exact same rate over the years, the Chinese guy or the South Asian would get diabetes much, much sooner than his Northern European counterpart. All things equal, even if they have the exact same size of body, same fat mass, it's because of how, in this case, in this study, South Asian men, although this applies to others, that's just this one study because it's so illustrative, look at the difference in fat cell size between South Asian men and Caucasian men. And again, I'm citing this particular study because it was the only one I could find that actually compared fat biopsies at this microscopic level. Look, I mean, those cells, they're about volumetrically probably 50 times bigger in the South Asian men. There's those subcutaneous fat cells, the fat cells just beneath the skin. And you see on the Caucasian side where if there's a bunch of stuff, those are actually capillaries. You can see the blood flow through these smaller fat cells is perfectly adequate, and those fat cells are very healthy. Now, what's interesting is that these men weighed the same. It's more than just a few. The subjects. All the subjects were controlled for body weight. So it's not like the South Asian men were just all fatter than the Caucasian men. They weren't. They don't have more fat mass. They just have bigger fat cells and fewer. So what do you think? What does this do to the personal fat threshold in these two specific populations within this study? One group storing it almost completely through hypertrophy, and the other group having some degree of hyperplasia. Who has the lower fat threshold? Whose body can tolerate fat not as well?
The South Asian.
The South Asian. So let's just say the South Asian population in this study has a personal fat threshold about here, whereas the Caucasian group in this study would have a fat threshold about here. But the amount of fat they had was the same. But what would we say? Because the South Asian population in the study has overwhelmed their personal fat threshold,
They're insulin resistant.
they're going to be insulin resistant. In contrast, the other group will be Caucasian. And again, will be insulin sensitive. To varying degrees, this has different sort of manifestations across various ethnicities. This study, again, I chose it because it was the only one I could find with fat biopsies. But there are other studies that identify similar body mass levels, but more pathogenic. For example, another study I could have cited was done in Chinese and European women. Same body size, same body fat, and yet per pound of fat, the Chinese female had much more likelihood of being insulin resistant. So I like to joke, if you want to be fat, you want to be Caucasian. That's kind of a theme, in all sincerity. I hope that's not too delicate to say. All right. Now, how can you correct insulin resistance? These are the three causes, and remember, one's more relevant than the others, and that is insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. So the key is to lower insulin. Now, before I provide the explicit solutions, which you are very well armed to help people with, I just want to review some of the basic effects of what we eat. Because insulin is the hormone. One way of describing it is that insulin is the hormone of the fed state. When you're eating something, insulin wants to go up. But that's not universally true because it partly depends on what you eat. And this is what we are eating within the United States. And to varying degrees, the same is reflected around the world. Over the past several decades, with the war on fat that started particularly in the US in the 70s, and again, it's expanded throughout the world, the percent of calories, while the total amount of calories across the board has gone up, as a percent, fat and protein calories have gone down, and of course that is made up for by carbohydrate calories. Well, this is a reproduction. In fact, I literally overlaid, I just like my own graphic style, I literally have overlaid this on this study that I'm citing in the bottom corner. When someone eats pure fat, this is what happens to their insulin. There was no significant difference at any time. Now, most people don't eat pure fat, but sometimes we do. So when someone eats pure protein, which sometimes people will do, I would say in our hubris, we've pulled these two apart. In nature, and I invite you to try to find a source of protein in nature that doesn't come with fat. You can't. It doesn't exist. In nature, all protein comes with fat. And again, in our fear of fat, we've pulled the two apart. But there's another kind of tangent of discussion here. You don't digest protein as well without the fat. So some of it, if you ever find you eat protein and it upsets your stomach, you probably aren't getting enough fat with it. But if someone eats pure protein, once again, no significant effect on insulin. When someone eats pure carbohydrate, this is how it looks. Indeed, again, I've deliberately and directly overlaid my animation here on what was the actual figure from the study. So you can see that I'm reproducing it. So insulin will go up about 10 times in a healthy person, and then it should be down to baseline by about 3 hours. But this is a healthy person who's insulin sensitive and can handle carbohydrates very well. If a person's insulin resistant, another way of saying that is that they are carbohydrate intolerant. They have a hard time burning sugar, or that much sugar, rather. And so if you were to do the same and give them what's called an oral glucose tolerance test, or OGTT, any gal who's pregnant knows what I'm talking about. You drink this little syrupy solution of glucose, this is what it would look like. It not only goes higher, indeed I'm being modest here, it could go 2 or 3 times higher than it did in the other instance, but it takes a lot longer to come back down, where their insulin levels could be elevated for 5 or 6 hours. But that, I hope, puts the earlier image I showed you in perspective, where when we are eating every 2 or 3 hours, and primarily, clearly, most of what people are eating is carbohydrate. Globally speaking, across the entire planet, the average number of, the percent of calories that come from carbohydrate in any given day is 70%. So this, I hope this is leaving an impression, understanding the scope of the problem. Insulin never has a chance to come down. By the time it finally starts to come down later at night, we spike it right back up again when we wake up. Now, another way of looking at that exact same data set is this, where there may be a modest effect of protein depending on the person, but there's a large effect when it's pure carbohydrate, but not all carbs are created equal. And I want to absolutely make sure that you're hearing me pound that drum. I'm not waging war on carbohydrates. I really am not. I don't intend for you to interpret it that way. Not all carbs are created equal. Getting 100 grams of bread will have a fantastically different effect on your insulin than 100 grams of broccoli, which would have no effect. All right, this was a study published a number of years ago that had healthy people, healthy insulin-sensitive people, just overeat carbohydrates for 1 week. This was their fasting glucose level. Their fasting glucose level didn't change. But when they looked at their insulin, this was their fasting insulin. By the end of the week, their insulin had gone up 2.5 times in a fasted state. This is insulin resistance. When insulin is elevated, but you need the higher insulin to keep your glucose in check. All right, now let's get to the explicit solutions, where if you've been kind of dozing through my lecture so far, come back to me now. Because this is the stuff you want to take. This is where the rubber meets the road. I've been saying that so far it's a horror story. It is. You understand it. you understand the scope of the problem, the prevalence of insulin resistance around the world, and here in North America. Those from Puerto Rico, the statistics will be very, very similar to what it is here in the US. In Canada will be slightly better than both Puerto Rico and the US, but not much. You understand the scope of the problem, you understand what the problem is, what insulin resistance is, and I've mentioned to you, although not described all the mechanisms whereby insulin resistance contributes to chronic diseases, and it does to every one of them, certainly all of the top 10 killers. And we've talked about where it comes from, why it matters, and now the solution, what to do about it. So I think that there are three nice strategies. One of them will sound a couple of them might seem familiar. But the first, control carbohydrates, control carbs. Number two, burn better. And number three, frequently fast. That's the least vague of all of them. But let's talk about each of them in a little more detail as we're nearing the end. So, control carbs. As I noted, the insulin effect of the carbohydrate is what is very important. You need to understand, how is this going to impact my insulin? In general, whole fruits and vegetables are going to be good. Now, I'm emphasizing whole fruits and vegetables. Don't juice these things. And you're stripping it down. You're robbing it of what is partly beneficial there. But on average, fruits and vegetables are things that I would give a green light to as a metabolic scientist. Other things like grains and of course sugar, you'd be very, very careful with. The insulin effect is going to be much, much greater in those. Now, the difference between these is largely the actual amount of fiber within them. So, one idea of controlling carbohydrates could be to focus on fiber. Do you appreciate my efforts of alliteration? I like things to be snappy and memorable. All right, as fiber goes up, it offsets the amount of glucose that can come from whatever else you're eating. As previous Dr. Googler, if anyone remembers him, and I appreciated some of the things he'd say was like attracts like. And fiber attracts glucose. And it will help mitigate the amount of glucose that actually hits our bloodstream. And if fiber is mitigating the amount of glucose coming in, it's no surprise. What do you think it does to insulin? And it does. There have been ample studies that have been published on this topic to take things like bread or a potato, one of the most easily sort of starchy, turned into blood sugar foods on the planet. And if you add fiber to that, you offset the glucose and the insulin. And you may be wondering, well, Ben, what is a good source of fiber? Yeah, of course, you have one in your toolkit. And so as someone is consuming a good source of fiber that doesn't have all the extras, I invite you guys, next time you're in a grocery store, look at what Metamucil has in it. Take a moment to turn it around. The second ingredient is sugar. Isn't that remarkable? It's so reflective these days of, yeah, we're selling you a solution and the problem, so you're going to need more of the solution. Unfortunately, it's a very cynical way of doing business. But nevertheless, focusing on fiber will take what is otherwise perhaps a very large insulin spike. And remember, insulin goes up. What does that do to fat burning if insulin's too high? It goes down. You turn off fat burning. And when it comes to insulin resistance, we need to be spending time in fat burning. Because if we look at those big hypertrophic fat cells, they're this big, we need them to be this big. We need to be below our personal fat threshold to prevent or reverse insulin resistance. Another molecule that's relevant here is something called chlorogenic acids. This, I suspect, will surprise most of you. Chlorogenic acids, these are direct quotes from this published study, have a direct effect. This study reports that they significantly reduce early fasting glucose and insulin responses in overweight men during an oral glucose tolerance test. So it's directly what I'm showing you here. You drink the glucose, you see how high the glucose and the insulin gets. You drink the glucose with some chlorogenic acids, you've suppressed the response. This is something most people don't know. We only think of fiber as doing this kind of thing. Well, chlorogenic acids do too. Can you think of a good source of chlorogenic acid? Yeah, well, another comment here is that it overall helps with fasting levels too. And of course, you have something in your toolkit to help with this. In fact, this is going to be a theme. You have, in all three of the rules that I just outlined, control carbs, burn better, and frequently fast, you have ways to help them in every one of these instances. Now, what about burn better? Of course, by burn better, I mean burn fat a little better. If you can somehow manipulate the metabolic magic within the person, or I should say the metabolic machinery within a body to burn fat better, that will shrink the fat cells, thereby lowering the person below, dropping them below their personal fat threshold, turning what was otherwise an insulin-resistant body into an insulin-sensitive body, and thereby lowering the risk of all the chronic diseases we talked about, improving their Alzheimer's risk, their migraine frequency, and even potentially their infertility. Now, you've seen this analogy before, and it's one that I'm very proud of, and I'm pleased when I looked at some talks within Unicity that some people are still using here. I gave birth to it, so I'm going to cite it with some degree of authority. If you look at a fuel tanker driving down the road, it has an engine that needs a lot of energy. Well, there is a fuel tank that it's using. It's this one small little tank tucked underneath the cab of the vehicle, or near the cab. It's what's providing all the fuel. But ironically, it is using so much of its own small little fuel tank to carry around all of this other fuel that is nothing but a burden because the engine can't use it. This is very much related to the body, where the amount of glucose we have, or let me rather, before I say that, ironically or tragically, this big tanker will have to stop every few hours to refuel. If the engine is only taking fuel from that small little tank, you need to top it up all the time. That's not very smart, is it? Because so much of what is being spent energy here in this truck is to haul that other fuel tank around. Well, this is very analogous to the body, where if a body is constantly sugar burning, we have about 2,000 calories in our body stored as we have 2,000 calories stored as glucose. And so if we start to run a little low and we're only ever sugar burning, we have to top it up all the time. Even a lean individual has over 100 times more energy stored on their body as fat. So just imagine if we have a metabolic machine that can tap as fat as its fuel, and we don't need to fill up as often. We're able to just keep on trucking down the road. But of course, this is what happens when insulin is elevated. When insulin is elevated, the engine is stuck burning fuel from that small tank. If we can change our macronutrients or our lifestyle in such a way to help insulin come down, now we have a dynamic engine that can shift from that small little tank that constantly needs filling up, to a much, much bigger tank that doesn't need us to pay any attention. We don't need to be worrying about going on a 10-mile hike and carrying a bunch of fat with us to top up our fat stores. And we won't even need a bunch of little glucose with us. We know we have enough fat to handle that hike. Well, the more we're tapping into fat, the more the fat cells are shrinking. So, of course, this one's obvious. If a person has a diet where their carbohydrates are being consumed with a high-quality fiber, that will mitigate the insulin spike from those carbohydrates, helping the body get back to fat burning much, much faster. At the same time, these molecules, chlorogenic acids, have a direct effect that I hope you will appreciate, because it's pretty interesting. So we can take a cell, and within a cell, fat is burned within the powerhouse of the cell. What's that called? The mitochondria. That is the powerhouse of the cell, where we are burning the majority of of the nutrients for energy within the body. Well, most people don't appreciate the fact that there is a gateway. In order for the fat to get into the mitochondria to be burned in the first place, it needs to be handled by this transporter called the carnitine acyl transporter, or the CAT. There are two of them. There's one further in. But CAT1, again, this is a transporter. This is a door, if you will. It's not, but it's a door. But it's not. Where it takes the fat and can say, okay, I know what to do with you. I'm going to let you in to the mitochondria to be burned. If you don't have any CAT1, it's impossible. You cannot burn fat. This is the gatekeeper for fat getting into the powerhouse to be burned. Well, chlorogenic acids will activate CAT1. It will increase its expression. It increases the amount of CAT1 that the mitochondria have. Of course, more CAT1 means more fat burning. Indeed, chlorogenic acids do this so well that they can increase fat burning by 24%. That is not an insignificant amount, let me tell you. In fact, this is so significant that the mitochondria begin burning more fat than they know what to do with. And this, what happens here, I mean, and I'm not, that sounds like I'm just being sort of cheeky. No, you do reach a point where the mitochondria can't stop burning fat. And now you say, well, what is the cell going to do with all that energy? It doesn't need the energy. It has a kind of diversion route. And that is the formation of these little molecules called ketones. I know ketones are vilified, and I don't mean to sound like I'm some advocate, and I don't mean to connect your ability to talk about these things with ketones, not at all. But I do want to demystify ketones. Ketones are simply molecules that are produced when the body is burning a lot of fat. Now, in some instances where there's no insulin in the body, like an untreated type of diabetic, that gets harmful. Too much of anything is harmful. I already told you too much glucose can kill a person. Too much ketones can too. But if you're not a type of diabetic, but also when it comes to breastfeeding in women, you have to be careful with ketones because in her body she's burning so much of her own fat to enrich her milk that she needs to be careful with her ketones too. But nevertheless, let's stick here. So the body is burning so much fat, and chlorogenic acids stimulate ketones. Now, once again, you have a good source of chlorogenic acids. One of the very first things I did when I got involved with Unicity, through the timeline that Sam explained, it was probably about 2015 or so, we quantified ketone level changes in fasted individuals, and we saw a significant increase. So there's a direct effect of Unimate with in the chlorogenic acids and other molecules at enhancing fat burning. Action similar. So here we have two different ways, the Unimate. Not only is it lowering glucose and insulin directly, which helps with fat burning, but it also is directly increasing fat burning. So on one hand, it's removing some of the thing that would be stopping the fat burning by helping insulin stay down, but at the same time, it's activating more fat burning directly by increasing the capability of the mitochondria to pull the fat in to burn. Now, what about balance? You may say, well, burning better is just a Unimate phenomenon. No, it's not. If you don't look too deep, sure, but if you look a little deeper and you're a little more precise, it does. Because when balance hits the large intestine, it gets metabolized by your microbiome, feeding the good bacteria. And like every living cell, there are metabolites that are released after eating. What is to the microbiome a waste product, to us is a benefit, and that is short-chain fatty acids. These are small little fats that get their way, they move their way into the bloodstream. They get absorbed across the gut wall into the blood. And short-chain fatty acids have been directly shown to increase fat burning. So right here, once again, even a product that you didn't think had a big influence, perhaps, on fat burning, it does. It has a direct influence. Now, let's move to the last one. Frequently fast. This one seems obvious. And it may seem that there's nothing more to say to the person and well, you just gotta kind of cowgirl it up and be tough and fast. This is the average individual. Well, not so average because this is the insulin-sensitive individual. At a minimum, we want to take this pattern of eating where it's 3 meals and 3 snacks, basically 6 meals a day, and turn it into 3 meals a day. At a minimum, we want to do that. And you would see that overnight, while a person's been fasting, their fat burning will be a little higher in the morning. And then during the meal gaps, maybe they get to a little point of fat burning as insulin comes down. Because remember, insulin turns off fat burning. When insulin's up, the metabolic machine goes to sugar burning. So what if someone could just fast through breakfast, extend that fast and break their fast at lunch? That, of course, will accelerate and enhance the fat burning. It will take what is a modest little campfire and turn it into a bit of a bonfire. But it can be hard to do that, right? It can be hard for people, and certainly the uninitiated. Fasting is difficult because you have to train your body to burn its own fat for fuel. That can be uncomfortable, especially if a person is stuck in sugar burning. A sugar burner will be hungrier much sooner than a fat burner. So we want to help people become better. Well, they want to burn better in order to fast better. So what is the best way to reduce hunger? Well, one way to reduce hunger is by allowing the body to have some ketones. Ketones have a direct effect at suppressing appetite. It's the body's way of telling the brain, hey brain, Normally, not normally, sometimes you burn glucose. You can also burn ketones, and because I'm burning a lot of fat right now, I got plenty of ketones coming to you. So we don't need to eat. And the brain can tell the body, hey, we're good. Ketones suppress appetite, and you have a way of helping people get some ketones. You may have to decide how to talk about ketones because, unfortunately, it's a very polarizing subject. Now, another molecule you can invoke is a molecule called theobromine. Theobromine actually has myriad effects, but one is that it is responsible for the bitter taste. So I was actually present and even spoke at the very global convention when Unimate was released. I was there, and I remember hearing people complaining about the bitter taste. I've actually always had a kind of appetite or a palate for bitter tastings. I like bitter, but I know a lot of people don't, especially nowadays where people are addicted to sweet. Bitter can be unpleasant. It was interesting for me at the time, though, to note people complaining about it. And even then, I told people, because I was a little familiar with this, I said, don't complain about it, leverage it. Because bitter molecules have direct effects at the fat cells and the brain to suppress, in the gut, to suppress appetite. So if you're talking to people and helping them to get through the hunger, to help enable a longer fast, you can say, there's something here, this tastes a little bitter, and you know what it is? It's theobromine. You know what it can do? It can help reduce appetite, because it does. Actually, bitter taste receptors are throughout all of your intestines, and they do other things too. One of them just simply being telling the brain, hey, don't eat for a bit, we're okay. Also, short-chain fatty acids. When the microbiome gets some good fiber to it, and as it burns the fiber, eats the fiber that we can't eat. Our body can't eat fiber, but the microbiome can. And again, produces short-chain fatty acids, which have a direct effect at improving appetite, or reducing hunger, in other words. So, these are three pillars that I submit to you can be very, very effective and hopefully very memorable tools in helping people ultimately improve their metabolic health, control carbs, burn better, and frequently fast. And each one of these, I described to you how in each instance they can benefit by these two products. And this is what it might look like, although everyone could do so differently. Unimate in the morning would help facilitate hunger and not fill the intestines. I know I work out in the morning and I don't mid-morning, and I don't like feeling full at all. And even fiber sometimes will put a lump in my gut that I just don't like while I'm exercising. But especially if the fiber is consumed prior to meals, it will mitigate, it'll offset the glucose and the insulinogenic effect of the meal, helping insulin stay lower, helping fat burning stay higher. Ultimately, the net effect of this approach will be shrinking the hypertrophic fat cells, thereby improving metabolic health, and ultimately, as fat cells shrink, insulin resistance does too. And this is the plague of the modern world. Now, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, especially if it's science related. Yeah, so how do those, I love that question. And guys, as a reminder, remember, I'm not speaking on behalf of you, this is only answering it as a scientist. And on this question, I can answer it with high authority. My PhD lab was one of the first labs that worked on these GLP-1 molecules in the first place, even identifying the hormone when it was first discovered. So, GLP-1, the primary mechanism. The question was being, how do people gain weight back when they stop taking the GLP-1 agonists, like Wegovy and Ozempic? Indeed, they'll even start gaining weight back during the drug. So the main mechanism of their weight loss, two main mechanisms. One is the fat burning. These molecules, Wegovy and Ozempic, will increase fat burning in the body. It activates those metabolic pathways. But at the same time, the primary mechanism, I would say, is that it induces nausea. They simply feel a little sick to their stomach. Every person on these drugs, if they are being honest with themselves, will admit it. And usually it becomes crushing. Usually that's the reason they say, forget about it, I'm off this. But even if they stay on it, if they grit through the discomfort, about 2 years in, the sweet cravings come back. Now you're left with the return of your cravings, which are only drug-induced, and you didn't actually learn to discipline your cravings. The drug did it for you artificially. So the cravings have started coming back, and you have more fat cells than you did before to fill up. And that's why I'm not even a little surprised to hear reports of people who decide that the nausea isn't worth it, or the $1,500 a month, they can't handle it anymore, and they gain their weight back with a vengeance. Hold on, and then let me just say that. Let me say else to it. Yeah, Darren.
It seems like a lot of time people who are doing these. Seems like a lot of time people who are doing these principles that you've shared with us stall out, aren't able to get results, and it seems like having them increase protein can help with that. And I know you've been really big on prioritized protein in the past. Can you talk a little about how protein relates to what you've shared today?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if someone is doing these three things and they will drop, and get to a plateau and say, I'm not done yet, well, then you have to say, because in nothing I really said here did I give explicit dietary advice. And I think there's something a little prudent about that, because people don't want to change their diet very readily. And you could take this kind of program and apply it without them changing anything they're eating. Hopefully they change when they eat, but you don't have to get too nitty-gritty with regards to managing your macronutrients. That, to me, is an enormous potential, but it's harder too. And I'm not a business person, but it's harder to sell. People don't want to have to change the way they eat. By taking a little sachet of something that tastes yummy, oh yeah, good, I can do that all day. But when you actually say, okay, now you've plateaued, we got to get you off it, that's when we would go back to my original principles when I first presented at a global conference years ago here. And I laid out my 3 rules: control carbs, which was still part of what I talked about today, avoid the most insulinogenic ones, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. Those last 2 matter. If a person is able to start taking their wheel of macronutrients in the 70% or so that is occupied by carbohydrates, if they can start shrinking that because the fats and the proteins get bigger, that's key. But I encourage you to not vilify fat. Don't get caught up in trying to play the calorie game. There is way too much nuance. Anyone who's invoking the laws of thermodynamics in the human body should be pointed at and laughed at. It doesn't work, because when insulin comes down, guess what happens to metabolic rate? It can go up. If a person spends 1 day in a state of low insulin versus constantly bumping it, their metabolic rate at the end of the day will be about 400 calories higher at the end. At the same time, they'll be making ketones, and ketones have a caloric value about the same as glucose does. But when you make a lot of ketones, you start breathing them out, or you're urinating them out. You are leaking energy from your body. So, Darren, that's my suggestion for getting off the plateau. Once this specific regimen hasn't worked, in addition to any other tools you may have in your toolkit, you very much go to diet. Control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat, and still frequently fast.
So is the cell becoming insulin resistant because of overexposure to the hormone insulin? Or is it that there's no room left in the fat cell to expand any further? And then if the body's in a caloric deficit, but insulin is high.
Let me do the first one.
Okay.
Get them all out.
So, I focused more intently on the fat cell for a purpose, because one, it's so important. Other tissues can become insulin resistant. The liver can, the brain can, the muscles can. But I strongly submit a fat-first focus, where the fat cell is the first domino to fall. It will be the first tissue to become insulin resistant in the average individual. Then the other ones will follow. Insulin on the fat cell, it actually doesn't directly, the hyperinsulinemia isn't directly contributing to insulin resistance at a fat cell. It's not responding that way to insulin. So at the fat cell, it becomes insulin resistant when it's reached its maximum dimension.
Okay.
If we were talking about a muscle cell, which is very, very important to talk about, because if your muscle becomes insulin resistant, it starts to shrink its protein pool, and you'll experience something called sarcopenia, or muscle wasting. The muscle, it doesn't become insulin resistant because it gets too big. Wouldn't that be a wonderful problem? But in this case, it becomes insulin resistant because of the signal it won't stop. So it kind of depends on the tissue. That was next level that I just didn't have time to get into.
Thank you. And then if somebody's in a caloric deficit but has high insulin levels, what happens? Does the fat burning trump the insulin being high, and is it just less effective?
So if insulin is high and calorie intake is low, they will die. That is incompatible with life, because insulin wants to push all the energy into the cells, all the nutrients in the bloodstream. It wants to push the glucose out, the fats out. It wants to stop lactate, which is very much a fuel for the body. There's no such thing as lactic acid, by the way. It's just lactate, and the body uses it for energy. But insulin wants to strip it all out of the blood. And that's fine for tissues like the liver and the muscle, and certainly fat tissue, because they have an amount of energy stored in them. Muscle has some glucose stored in it. Muscle even has a little fat stored in it to burn. It has its own little energy reserve. The brain has no such energy reserve. It must constantly be pulling its energy from the blood. And the brain is a high metabolic rate organ. It's among the top 3 metabolic rates. It is number 3, behind the kidneys and the heart. So the brain will say, hey, insulin, you've given all that energy to everybody else. I'm running out and I need to shut off. So they'll go unconscious first, and if the problem persists, they will die a few minutes later. So it cannot work.
I struggled with neuropathy so bad I thought I was going to have my feet amputated. On this protocol, in 30 days, reduced that pain by 80% and 90 days by 95%.
Wow, that's amazing.
Give the context on, you're fasting. There's the less sugar I was eating. I was doing everything the protocol says, but what was happening that let me experience that? Because that obviously was like
Yeah. So you guys, any other question? Don't make it about you. I hate to say it like that. I just don't want to be seen that I'm kind of giving any kind of medical advice, which I'm not, because I'm not telling you. I don't have a medical license, and I'm not practicing medicine. So neurons, so what is the effect of these metabolic changes on neuropathy? Neuropathy is the destruction of neurons. Glucose contributes to that directly, because if glucose levels are too high, it is overwhelming the neuron's ability, the nerve's ability to burn the glucose. And as the glucose is accumulating in that cell, and the cell just has too much to burn, the glucose gets converted into something called sorbitol. Have you guys ever heard of sorbitol? If you've ever had sugar-free gummy bears or some sugar-free chocolate, you felt the effects of it. But that's the same problem. So sorbitol, which is a derivative of non-enzymatic metabolite of glucose, it cannot cross cell membranes. So it gets stuck in the nerves, and you get more and more and more sorbitol. Same thing happens in blood vessels of the legs especially. And it starts, there's something called an osmotic gradient. I'm getting really, really specific. But this molecule will start pulling in water. And eventually the cell can't handle it all, and it bursts, the neurons die. But they can recover. You can extend nerves and improve the function. Interestingly, that is the mechanism whereby if you eat sugar-free gummy bears with sorbitol or any OL sugar ending, you'll get, to put it mildly, you won't want to be in public for a period of time. It's because that molecule will not pass the cells of the gut. It will stay in the gut and pull water into it. And then what you think is just going to be you politely passing gas is not something you want to risk. Yeah.
Okay, so you talked about protein and fats, and I try to educate people on that all the time. And I've heard you and a number of others talk about how protein's stored differently in the absence of fat. So can you talk to us about what happens to protein when there's not enough fats?
Yeah. So I don't think I've talked, maybe I have talked about storing it, but I wouldn't have said it that way. So fat is relevant with protein in 2 ways. And let me just reiterate, it does not happen in nature. There is no such thing as protein without fat in nature. I think that there's something important to that, and it behooves us to not think we know better than the creator or nature or evolution or whatever. So in this case, 1, you don't digest the protein as well. When you get protein coming down the digestive tract, the stomach acids will break it up into some chunks, but you still can't absorb that. There's digestion and there's absorption. And absorption is when you're moving it into the blood. You have to snip that apart through what's called proteolytic enzymes. Proteolytic enzymes are activated more aggressively when they get exposed to bile acids.